Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origins Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of the origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origins Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and Media Vision. It is my pleasure today to introduce Lisa Hildegrand, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Stony Brook University and an ISO Fellow. And she will talk to us about ethnobotany in Southwest Ethiopia, how today's people-plant relationships help us understand the story of domestication. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hildegrand.
Thank you, Glenn, for a really kind introduction. And I'm really glad to be back here at Case Western for this series. Last year, about a year ago, I spoke about my work in Kenya, looking at early pastoralists in the Turkana Basin. And today, we're going to hop over the border into Southwest Ethiopia and look at a very different set of conditions and a very different kind of potential story about the beginnings of farming in Southwest Ethiopian highlands. And to do that, one of the main data streams I'm going to be bringing in is not archaeology, but I'm going to put on my ethnobotany hat and look at what the knowledge of indigenous people in Southwest Ethiopia can tell the world about their crops and about the history that brought those crops into cultivation in the first place. And I want to say I love doing ethnobotany and I love talking about ethnobotany because when you're an archaeologist, you spend so much time in holes in the ground, digging very carefully, and you don't necessarily get to know people as well as you might. And when you do ethnobotanical research, on the other hand, it's your job to really get to know people and understand what's important to them and help bring that knowledge to the world and help conserve that knowledge. So I'm really glad to be talking about this today. And hopefully people who were at the talk last year, we may try to connect a few of those dots for you across the border and across these different stories. So when I say we're going to be studying the beginnings of food production in Ethiopia, that's the beginnings of farming and the beginnings of animal herding. And a lot of people say, well, why should we really care about this, right? I mean, okay, we all eat farmed food these days, but, humans had a lot of advances over the course of human history. And some of these are depicted here, the beginnings of bipedality, the beginnings of stone tool making, ever advanced innovations in terms of what kind of tools people make. And then when you look at the human history of producing food rather than hunting and gathering food, you can see it occupies this tiny little red sliver at the end of our chronological record. So everybody's like, well, that's a short period. But when you look at that in the larger picture, when you unpack what happens in that 10,000 years, it's a huge proportion of what we actively use as a society today. It's what supports us being here. It's the development of physical storage once you have crops to store. It's the development of specialization and, people doing specific things rather than everybody just doing the same thing. It's the beginning of monumentality and symbolic architecture, and it's the beginning of urbanism in cities. And so the vast majority of us in the world today live a life that's only possible because food production was invented. So this is a really important event, a really key chapter in the broader book of human history. And if we want to understand why we are the way today, we need to look at these early changes and understand why and how people started producing food and how those pathways varied in different parts of the world. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to start with just a few key concepts because these are terms that are going to be coming up all through the talk, and I want you to have your feet on solid ground here. So one of those concepts is domestication, and that is the process by which selective pressure by humans changes the morphology of plants or animals in a way that makes those plants or animals dependent on humans to survive or to reproduce. So it's a sort of a coevolution where humans affect plants and animals, and then the plants and animals need humans to get by. Food production sounds like the same thing, but it's actually kind of different. Food production is human management of plants or animals. And so this could be herding wild or domestic animals. It could be protecting animals from predators, transplanting plants into new areas where you're planning on going next year, broadcasting seed, weeding out plant competitors. All these things are things people do to increase the productivity or decrease the losses of the plants and animals that are significant to them. However, that's different from domestication because not all of these acts actually lead to morphological change or dependence. Okay, a lot of these can be done on wild plants and animals as well. The third thing is agriculture, and that's well-established economies of plant food production that use domestic crops. And then the fourth is the kind of animal equivalent of that, which is pastoralism. Those are economies that are heavily focused on herding domestic livestock. So with those concepts in the bag, we're going to look at how we can study these as archaeologists and as archaeologists who practice ethnobotany. So briefly, ethnobotany is the study of relationships between plants and people. And this is definitely a sort of a two-way street. People can affect plants, and plants can affect the behavior of people. So you have to kind of keep an open mind. It's also a two-way street between the study of people and social systems and cultural systems on the one side, and biological reality on the other side. So ethnobotany by nature is a very interdisciplinary cup of tea. And when I say we're studying the relationships between plants and people, a lot of people just think ethnobotanists go out and find out what are the useful plants or what are the key crops. Like, okay, that's great. That's part of what ethnobotany is. But plants give us more than food. They give us things that are important in rituals. They are medicine. They can provide clothing. They provide structure. And, think about the shaft of a spear. You want a good hardwood for your spear shaft. So, plant uses are much more than food, and they have much more significance than just putting them in your belly. And so in addition to understanding the utility of plants, we also look at things like folk taxonomy. There are many different naming systems for plants around the world, and each ethnic group has its own naming system for understanding the plants around them. And we can learn a lot from the way different groups of people classify the plants in their world. A related thing to that is what we call ethnoscience, because newsflash, post-Enlightenment Western science is not the only form of science out there. There are all sorts of indigenous bodies of science and, people who are healers or, gatherers of plants. They have their understanding of plants' place in the world according to their existing knowledge systems, and that's very important as well. And then finally, we look at how people manage plants around them. So let's look at what we're going to do throughout the arc of this talk. First, I'm going to give you some historical and theoretical background for talking about plant domestication that will help us understand the case study that I'm going to then tell you about. I'm also going to give you a sort of an environmental and geophysical backdrop to where our part of the world that we're going to be looking at. And then as we go on, after the first Q&A, we'll talk about the specific ethnobotanical research and insights I did in Southwest Ethiopia. And then we'll move on to the archaeology side of things where there are a lot of unanswered questions. So that's where we're going today, and I hope we have a good journey together. Okay, first of all, as I said, ethnobotany is a two-way street trying to understand both biological processes, on the green side, and social processes, I put them over here on the blue side. So biological processes are survival and reproduction and distribution of the plants themselves. And then over here on the human side, we're talking about decisions and actions that may be taken by individuals and groups, and all of these things affect each other. Then when you move into a specific query, like the beginnings of food production, you start understanding that actually there's a lot going on both sides of this equation. And so there's been a lot of work. People, I mean, you go all the way back to Darwin, people trying to figure out how plants got domesticated. And so the study of plant domestication is an inherent part of the study of evolution, because it is it's one of Charles Darwin's poster children, right? So the people, the scholars who really focused on the sort of biological aspect of this are listed over here. And you can see they started with Darwin, but they went all the way, they've gone all the way up through the modern day. And here are some of them. Here's Darwin, who first observed the results of selective pressure on crop plants. Vavilov sent people all over the world to document different agricultural systems and suggested that those agricultural systems were as old as the genetic diversity within them indicated. So he pioneered this idea of centers of domestication. Edgar Anderson was a really great guy at the Missouri Botanical Garden. He said, hey, people don't even have to do this on purpose. You can get agriculture by seeds propagating in dump heaps. And so again, very much on the biological side of things. Jack Harlan, wonderful man, he revisited all these areas that Vavilov had identified as potential domestication centers. And he also noted that some were not really centers. They were huge areas spread out where there was probably a lot of innovation over a broad geographic area. And then there was David Rindos in the late 80s and early 90s, who kind of echoed Edgar Anderson by saying, domestication can happen incidentally. It's not like somebody wakes up one day and says, I'm going to domesticate a tomato. This is a gradual set of processes that can unfold in a way that isn't predetermined. So these guys, and these were all men. There are people who came into the picture later, but these guys all gave us enormous insights into what can happen on the biological side of things. At the same time, or actually kind of later on in this chronological spectrum, you have a bunch of archaeological researchers and social researchers who are thinking about what happens on the human side of things. And a lot of these people were arguing that domestication was a social process that may have been oriented by people's desire for ritual or for certain foods at certain times. And so they were really stressing the human side of the equation and not the biological side. Then there was sort of a cluster of people in the late 80s and early 90s, but sort of with a background much earlier than that, that said they were pushing the theory that climate changes and massive environmental changes that put pressure on human populations, that those were the impetus for plant domestication. And so some of them are listed here. There was a whole series of articles right at the end of the 80s, the early 90s, that really pushed this theory of environmental change as a prime mover. And a lot of this, some of it was derived from earlier people like Gordon Childe, but a lot of this derived from people working in the Middle East on the Fertile Crescent. And there was some back and forth as to how much environmental change had taken place and which environmental change was important. Pushing back against that was actually a group of people led by Robert and Linda Braidwood. And they did their research before we really understood the environmental changes. And Robert Braidwood basically said, you don't need environmental change to get people to do this. So that was another sort of debate going on. Then as time went on, I think a lot of archaeologists realized that there was never going to be one prime mover or one smoking gun process, but rather that maybe different things happened all over the world. And instead of looking for one narrative, we should be exploring the various processes that could lead to this. And so two people who kind of pioneered that approach were Gordon Hillman. He tried to clarify for animals and for plants the various processes of change that can lead to domestication over time. And Bruce Smith in the early 2000s made the point, unfortunately, he chose the name low-level food production, which I think is kind of condescending to the people who practice this. This is very sophisticated. But he said, you know, you don't need to become a full-time agriculturalist right away. You can still maintain hunting, gathering, and food production. And depending on what happens year by year, one year you may be more of a farmer, and one year you may be more of a hunter-gatherer, and that's okay. And so these guys all kind of made it clear what a diverse landscape of possibilities we're operating in. So more recently, there have been a few other things in that regard, using behavioral ecology theory, and also viewing humans as an organism that builds their own niche through cultivation and agriculture. So these sorts of debates and insights keep coming up. What I'd like to, taking a step back from all these massive amounts of theory and ideas, really when you unpack food production, there are a bunch of different processes in this transformation. They don't all happen at once, and they have different explanations. So one thing that happens is people start to manage plants and animals, and that could be embodied in what Bruce Smith called low-level food production. You can have selection processes that result in morphological change and dependence on humans. That's domestication. And all of that can happen before you actually convert to an economy that emphasizes food production or is dependent on it. And also, only after that will a food production system necessarily spread to new areas. And it could do that by the movement of people or the movement of ideas. So that's the broader framework. Quickly, where we're going to explore this is in Africa, which has an unusual sequence of economic change. Domestic animals were established in Africa before domestic plants were. And we're going to look at one little area of Africa. We're going to look at Southwest Ethiopia. So this is one tiny area of a huge and complicated history that played out across the African continent. So why are we interested in Ethiopia and the area around it? Well, you can see that if you look at White's vegetation map of Africa, there are a lot of regions of Africa that have big bodies of vegetative communities. And Ethiopia and the Turkana Basin adjacent to it are places where lots of little ecological types and habitats interact in a very short space. So it's exceptional in that way, and it can teach us things that we might not learn in some of these other big ecological zones. What's shaping that is the fact that you've got quite a bit of topography, and you've also got different rainfall systems hitting different parts of this region and leading to rainfall delivery of different sorts at different times of the year. So here's a topographic map of Ethiopia as a whole, and Southwest Ethiopia in particular. So you can see there is a lot of topographic variation. And you can also see this is one of the wettest parts of Africa over here on the rainfall map. And you can see the effect of topographic variation on vegetation. These two photos are taken about a 20-minute walk from each other on the side of a mountain, high up and low down. And here are some other photos of vegetation in and around Southwest Ethiopia and the topography and everything. So you can see this is not a boring area. This is a very exciting area with a lot of biodiversity and a lot of chances for people to have different kinds of relationships with plants. And finally, the crops that have emerged here have very unusual life cycles and products. One of them is coffee, which many of us are probably drinking right now. And another one is this giant plant called Enset that has a big underground starch package. It's also got huge cultural diversity in terms of different language groups and ethnic groups. And it still has people living on the edge of the rainforest where they have access to wild resources. So we have the chance to study both wild and domestic resources in tandem. So that's why I love Southwest Ethiopia and why I think it's a really great place to work. We've covered the theoretical and historical backdrop and the environments. And so I want to see if people have questions.
How confident are we? You talked about this, food production emerging really over the last 10,000 or so years. Were there false starts? How confident are we that this didn't emerge beforehand?
That's a really good question. And I would say, we're definitely looking for it earlier. But in most of the really well-known centers of domestication, like Southwest Asia for wheat and barley and, the lentils, and also in Mesoamerica, basically there you've got really clear indicators of morphological change in crop plants. Okay, so wheat goes from its wild form where all the seeds just shatter and fall off the rachis to one where they're held tight. That's a smoking gun. And people have been looking for it in epipaleolithic circumstances, but they're not finding it. I think the bigger question is, I would say during the 80s and the 90s, archaeologists were very focused on finding that smoking gun. Woohoo, it's domestic, But I think over time since then, we've got a little bit more flexible in terms of what we think is important. And it's clear that people were using these starchy seeds pretty intensively in the epipaleolithic. They just didn't get domesticated. So you've got archaeobotanists diligently peering over their microscopes, looking for smoking guns, but also looking for changing patterns of representation of certain taxa in the archaeological record. And so, we're using the morphological changes as smoking gun, but we're also probing that period before that to say, well, what did people do? Or what were they doing before something was actually domesticated? And I think that's an equally important, valid question.
So Barb Fidel asks if there's been a rainforest there for a long time. Is it a new rainforest or an ancient rainforest?
It is ancient because Southwest Ethiopia, I'm going to go back here to this map because I was trying to go kind of fast here. So you've got the Atlantic rainfall system that is bringing rain up through here, and there should be another red arrow here, okay? And so you've got rain coming from the Atlantic across the Congo Basin recycled and then getting dumped on the Southwest Ethiopian highlands. And then you've got these Indian Ocean monsoons that are also coming up, and they dump wherever they hit the first high land, and they keep dumping while the land is high. So this area is really getting a lot of rainfall for much of the year. And even, you can see the edges of the modern ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone rainfall distribution is up here. So one of my colleagues and I, Steve Brandt and I, have the theory that even during hyper-arid periods in Africa, when the monsoons did not push this far north, they were still pushing far enough north to dump rainfall on Southwest Ethiopia. So we think Southwest Ethiopia is likely a refugium for plants and animals and people during hyper-arid periods. Now, whether it was always a rainforest in those hyper-arid periods is not clear. But it's certainly wetter than just about anywhere else in the region, except for the Congo Basin itself. Now we're going to move on to specific ethnobotanical research and insights from Southwest Ethiopia. And as I said, there are many different processes involved in the beginnings of food production. And we're going to focus on the two of these: initial management of plants and animals, and the selection processes that can happen when people are manipulating plants. So the first crop I'm going to talk to you is called Enset, And its Latin name, its full Latin name is Enset ventricosum. It is a member of the banana family. Actually, bananas way back when, and we're talking like many millions of years ago, bananas probably are an offshoot from Enset in the banana family. And so you can see it here growing wild on the hillside and also in a wild stand here. There are a few other species of Enset sprinkled through Africa, and the only place where Enset has been domesticated and is grown by people is that pink blob there. Let's look at that a little bit more carefully. In this slide, you can see Enset in domestic and agrarian, in garden contexts. This is a big, beautiful Enset garden in southwest Ethiopia. And this is kind of, another more isolated thing. This is a baby Enset that has been clonally reproduced. So they took a corm, they took a big Enset plant, and they basically cut it off at the bottom at this certain place where if you cut it, it's going to go crazy and produce a whole bunch of clones. So you can probably see 100 shoots there. Each of those can become its own individual Enset plant, like this one or that one. So it's a remarkable domesticate in the way you can propagate it. Also, when you look at southwest Ethiopia and where Enset is cultivated, you can see it's not growing in any of these river gorges here. That's because to get a cool enough and wet enough conditions, it really needs to be at about 1,100 meters or higher. So it does have specific environmental requirements. Now, when you look at how people use Enset, there are a lot of potential uses. First of all, for food, maybe you can see this kind of bulbous thing sticking out here. So this is the corm of the Enset, and once you kind of get all the dirt off of it and get it clean, there's a huge starch body in there that you can pound up or you can just put in a pot and cook. Enset also produces, those big leaves and big pseudostem areas. This house has been made out of Enset. The roof is Enset leaves. It's remarkable. Here's some paste that's been developed from the starch, either from the corm or from these pseudostems. Basically, its trunk, and I hate to use that word because it's not a tree, but the vertical axis of Enset is a lot like a giant celery stalk, okay, with these things that you can peel off, and there's a lot of starch in there. This can then be made into a sort of a pancake or a flatbread and cooked on a griddle. And also, it has a lot of fiber running through it, just like when you bite into a piece of celery, that fiber that gets caught in your tooth. Enset also has fibers, and those can be made into ropes. And then lastly, the thing we should not forget is Enset also has ritual uses. So these ladies were mourning a stillbirth, and this was the dance they were doing to, try to make sure that that wouldn't happen to anybody else in their community again. So, plants have their utilitarian aspects, and they also have their social aspects. So I did quite a bit of work on Enset among the Shako, who are living in southwest Ethiopia. And they were able to show me both their garden at Enset and where Enset was growing in the wild. And so one of the first things I tried to do was compare the two and use the difference between wild and domestic as a way to understand the way the domestication process had changed the Enset plant. And so this resulted in a few interesting results. As wild Enset propagates itself by seed dispersal, and of course, domestic Enset is propagated by humans via clonal shoots. Most domestic Enset doesn't really flower effectively, doesn't produce that many seeds. Wild Enset grows to be a very large size before it puts up its flower and fruit and reproduces, whereas the domestic Enset, it will grow to a smaller size, and then it will put up this flower and kind of half-half attempt at fruits, but that doesn't really produce much. And then in terms of shape, wild Enset grows to be very wide at the bottom with a big corm. And domestic Enset in gardens never gets that width. So this is my sketch of a wild Enset, and you can see, you know, any woman who's ever looked for pear-shaped clothes, wild Enset is what I think of there. And then, you know, domestic Enset is just kind of straight up and down with a small corm. And so when you do a sort of size distribution of Enset height and width at the base, this is what you come up with. And what's really interesting here is you can see that the domestication process and the selection that happened, people were specifically aiming for smaller plants that would have smaller corms. So they weren't aiming for a high yield. And so you have to ask yourself, why wouldn't they want a high yield? Well, it seems that the domestic Enset is much more tender. And when you cook it, it turns into this nice kind of fluffy, starchy thing. I mean, everybody knows what a baked potato is like with that sort of fluffy starchiness. You can cook a wild Enset corm piece for a long time and it still just stays hard and doesn't get that nice starchy nature to it. So it's clear that when people had a choice to go for yield but not great palatability versus less yield and higher palatability, they went for the palatability. And that's an interesting insight because it suggests that domestication isn't always just about quantity, it's also about the quality. The sort of disappointing results here is that I wasn't able to find anything that would turn up as a sort of a smoking gun in the archaeological record. There aren't any botanical differences that you're going to be able to measure when you're digging up some tiny fragment of Enset in an archaeological deposit. But on the other hand, the insights here are important. One thing that turned up is that wild Enset thrives in burned and disturbed areas. And so if you wanted to have more Enset out there, you could kind of make that happen by burning an area and letting the Enset propagate in it without specifically setting up a garden. And this led me to suggest that the whole process of Enset going from fully wild to more managed was probably a two-step process, or maybe even more than 2 steps. The first step might have been landscape management, burning, transplanting, and that might have been geared towards improving the abundance. And then later on, the cloning, once people figured out how to do that cloning maneuver, they could specifically target individual Enset plants that by their shape or whatever, people figured this was going to be palatable, and they could propagate that and get more of that type. And so that to me was really interesting because it's not just something that happens once. This is a long-term project. This is a long-term process that probably unfolded over many generations with different people contributing to it. So now let's move to the second crop the Shako are absolute experts in cultivating, and that is yams. And just a word to the wise, these are not the yams that you have for Thanksgiving coming up. Actually, the yams that we eat at Thanksgiving are sweet potatoes, and that's a different genus in a different family. And somehow there's been a sort of a misnomer applied to them. But true yams are the genus Dioscorea in the family Dioscoreaceae. And the African ones are part of this complex of multiple species that are all probably very closely related and even interbreeding with each other. The yams grow in staked fields and under trees and gardens and in abandoned homesteads, also in uncultivated forest and wooded grassland environments. So they grow in wild settings where they may be completely wild, or they may have sort of escaped from cultivation at some point, and they grow in domestic settings. They're perennials, so you have recurring harvests from the same plant year after year after year if you do a good job with it. What's really interesting with yams is that when they're growing in the wild, they prefer open or disturbed environments. They don't like to grow in closed forests. In the garden, that can be kind of too open and too sunny for them. So yams that are just growing along stakes in a garden field may be vulnerable to drought. On the other hand, if you plant a yam kind of in a shaded part of the garden under a tree, these can become huge and they generally last through droughts and, you know, don't die under those circumstances. Living with the shako for more than a year, I gradually came to learn about a process that some of them do, which I decided to call adoptive transplantation. And this is something that didn't really appear anywhere else in the ethnobotanical record. And what this is moving yam plants from wild or feral contexts to home gardens. And so this has a few benefits. Once you do that, it becomes your yam, and you can monitor it better. So you have some predictability and control in your access. Also, if you plant it in your garden in a place where you've arranged lots of nice soft soil, the tuber will grow more nicely, it'll grow bigger, it won't be as tough, and it probably won't produce as many toxins as it would in the wild. So you get both increased quality and quantity. So who does this? Well, first of all, nobody's doing it in the areas where wild yams are already abundant because they don't need to. Rather, the people who do this are people who live in areas where there aren't many yams in the wild and they want to take control over them. And the second thing is that, you know, a lot of people think that women were responsible for plant domestication because, you know, man the hunter, woman the gatherer. But in this case, it turned out that it was the unmarried men who were doing this because they were trying to set up a garden so that when they got married, their wife would come and have, you know, a decent start on things. And so they were going out in the forest and getting these yams and bringing them back and planting them in the garden that they were trying to develop for their future family. They also did it because they could roast these yams themselves. And men in Sheko aren't really into grain food prep of grinding and that sort of thing. Like that's not in their gender division of labor. So having food on hand that they could roast was great. So that's the second specific crop. I'm going to quickly take you through some of the bigger context and how this all fits together. I wanted to understand not just these crops, but also the broader set of resources. So I did a whole bunch of cultural ecology surveys all around Sheko land, which is the green areas there, and tried to understand all the resources that they use. And in doing so, I found that wild Enset really only grows in the uplands. It thrives in disturbed areas. You can eat it year round. It's all right to eat. It's not great. And wild yams are rare in the uplands, abundant in the lowlands, again, thrived in disturbed areas, especially if you had a disturbed area in the uplands, yams would do all right there. But they only have good tubers in the dry season. On the other hand, they are much nicer to eat than Enset. They're better food. So in addition to those kind of lead actors, I documented a whole bunch of other plants that Sheko eat or use for other things. And I also documented the times of year and the environments that they appear in. So the light blue stuff is times of year when they really aren't available, and the dark blue is the season for using that plant. So you can see there's a lot of wild plants out there that tend to cluster in certain times in certain areas. In addition to the plants, there's honey. These are beehives, and this is a man serving honey beer to his son. And there's also the chance to do hunting via trapping. And there are different schedules for honey harvests in different areas. So this is a big source of calories and also just a sort of a food that everybody really appreciates. Similarly, everybody appreciates game and fish. These are very important sources of protein with different distributions in highlands and lowlands. So I put this together into a few categories in a chart, and you can see how upland and lowland areas differ in the packages of resources that are there. So it's great to live in the lowlands down in these months of the year, January, February, March, October, November, December, because you've got yams and you've got fish. There really isn't anything to eat there during the middle of the year. So then in the uplands, you've got pretty good resources in the middle of the year, but you never have fish. So when you put all this together, you can surmise what a hunter-gatherer group might make in terms of decisions in a situation like this, where maybe they moved regularly between lowlands during January, February, March, then into the uplands, and then back into the lowlands at the end of the year to take advantage of the best of both worlds. Looking at environmental disturbances, this changes the calculations somewhat, because if you start disturbing things in the uplands, you start seeing more Enset, you may be able to see more game, and suddenly you've got a bunch of different calculations. And the more you disturb the uplands, the more attractive they get in terms of what you can get there, how good it tastes, and how long during the year you can get it. So this has implications for domestication. I suggested on the basis of this that people may have originally been transhumant, that is seasonally mobile hunters and gatherers. And maybe while they were in the uplands, they started disturbing the uplands, and the uplands got better and better. And eventually people started spending most of their time up there and domesticated yams and Enset in these upland contexts. I can see I'm over time for this segment, so I'm not going to go into details here, but I would say that since I did this field work, there's been a lot more botanical work in Ethiopia, and some of these different ecological types have been better defined. And there's a lot more work for people like me to do. This is Ibfries and Elisabeth Demisu, leading botanists in Ethiopia. And they've defined different environmental zones in the country. And you can see it's more complicated than how I presented it. And so I did my work in this study area over here. But if you're really trying to look at upland-lowland interactions, there are a lot more places to look at it and understand the different balances of resources. So we've got a lot more to do. And that is the end of part 2. For the third part of the talk, we're gonna go over to the archaeology and see just how much we don't know. And I think this is really important because especially the past year and a half have taught so many people in the public that science isn't just established fact. Like, scientists are constantly learning, constantly revising, and sometimes running into real roadblocks in terms of our research concepts or our ability to answer questions. And so I want you to understand what archaeology has and has not been able to tell us, even with this ethnobotanical knowledge. So going into the archaeology, okay, we have an idea that domestication took place in upland environments, but we still don't know precisely when that happened. Was it in the early Holocene, 10,000 to 7,000 years ago when everything was really wet, or was it during a dry period later? What did these domestication processes happen before or after livestock was in the picture? How, what sort of social processes might have been involved in that? And these are questions we're only beginning to attack. I did the Kafa Archaeological Project survey and excavations in 2004 and 2006, and started this process. It was very grueling because the area had never seen any archaeological survey before at all. Everybody kind of said, well, good luck out there, because Southwest Ethiopia has a lot of basalt. Basalt is not known for producing caves and rock shelters. It's so wet that, you sneeze and a plant has grown up where your foot is. The ground cover is 100%, so you're not finding sites. It's, it's very challenging. And yet still we had some good fortune. First of all, in a certain area, the basalt is occurring in these sort of pancake-like tabular formations, and some of them are harder than others. And so when the weak ones erode, then you do get a rock shelter. In the course of 4 or 5 months of archaeological survey on horseback, on foot, with local people helping out and telling us about places, we were able to locate 27 rock shelters, and 10 of them had no deposits in them. And then we did a bunch of testing and found 5 with productive deposits, others with less productive. And the whole idea with this was to start testing the hypothesis that domestication might have happened in uplands. So we were trying to find both upland and lowland rock shelters. And here you can see we're already having difficulty. We've got some in upland areas here. We've got one in a lowland area, a few in intermediate, but it wasn't really the kind of sampling I was hoping for. Still, a beginning is a beginning. Here's one of the lowland rock shelters called Coca, with 2 boulders just kind of bumping up against each other away from the hillside. We got more than a meter down. We found charcoal, chipped stone, and pottery down to the penultimate lowest excavated area. So there's a hint that we're getting to a time prior to ceramics. In the end, this didn't produce very aged dates. So Coca only went back about 2,000 years. That's probably not old enough to track the beginning of domestication. And the plant preservation in there was not particularly helpful. Another really helpful rock shelter was called Kumali. This is at a much higher elevation. It's kind of right here on the edge of the corner, right by a path down to the lowlands. And these are farmed fields, otherwise the whole area would be forested. And this area is a natural route from highlands to lowlands, so you can imagine the rock shelter could have been an important place. It's also nice and dry, so a great place for potential plant preservation. I did a number of excavations towards the front of the rock shelter and also towards the rear, trying to avoid the rodent burrow area. In the front, we found 3 separate hearths at 3 different points in time. So there's clearly an occupational history here. People are producing these sort of crescent-shaped lithic pieces that are, a hallmark of the later Stone Age. So that was great. No smoking gun. In the back of the rock shelter, we found some very interesting things. Here you can see there's a lot of dried plant material. And if you look at it really closely, some of that is probably fibers and stem material from Enset. But we can't tell if it's wild Enset or domestic Enset. So we know people were using it, but we don't know if this was a domestication situation. The other interesting thing we found back here was a heck of a lot of animal dung. And it looked like the Enset had been brought in as bedding, and we actually found a stake, not on the surface, but under, in the excavation, we found a stake that had been driven into the ground. So it looks like people were tethering sheep or goats back there and had brought in bedding material for them. So that's a really interesting, glimpse into what was going on. All of this was happening. This is a profile from the rock shelter in the area, around 2,000 years ago, or maybe a little younger than that. Then we get into some rodent burrows, and then there's a deeper part that is quite old, but there were so many rocks there, it was really difficult to reconstruct human behavior. So, yeah, just a few views of some of the stone tools that came out of the Kafa rock shelter sites and the pottery which appeared in the upper levels. So this was interesting to me because it's not at all like the pottery that we've been finding down around Lake Turkana. This is a completely different tradition, and also later than some of the early pastoral pottery. So there's clearly a lot to be done on that to clarify what's going on. And the bottom line is we need rock shelters with deeper deposits that take us into deeper time. But there's still a lot of analysis to do on the plant materials pictured here, and also on some of this animal dung material. Animal dung is an intriguing new arena of analysis because we're able to look at fungal spores and see what kind of a diet those animals had and that sort of thing. So this is all great, but it hasn't really answered any of the questions that we were trying to address. And it's very frustrating. Okay, we've got the beginnings of a record, but we still don't know when, we still don't know what kind of environment, and we still don't know if something happened before livestock got there. And this is because so far the archaeological record before 2000 BP is still quite sketchy. It's also because we don't have a smoking gun archaeologically for Enset and yam domestication, because it's just not clear. So a lot more work is needed, and I think a great future endeavor would be to try to connect these two field areas in and around Lake Turkana with the connected uplands. And bear in mind that Lake Turkana was once much bigger and pushing far over the border on the Ethiopia side, and was quite near to some of these highland environments. So in terms of what I want to do, I want to be doing survey and excavation in some of these areas that would have been not so far from the edge of Lake Turkana to try to stitch these two areas together and maybe get a few more answers. So where does this leave us? Well, we've got, as I said, distinct processes with different explanations. And one thing that I think this has taught us is the limits of archaeological data for us. And the ways that ethnobotany can give us specific answers on things that the archaeological data are never going to tell us. And it's really important to cultivate these two approaches in a sort of an interdisciplinary research framework. And if you back out again to the big framework for studying early food production, you can see how different components of ethnobotany have basically been positioned in different parts of this theoretical landscape. So finding out about the environmental requirements of yams and Enset is over here on the botanical side. On the other hand, finding out that these bachelors and young guys, hoping to get married are the ones that are doing this, that's a very important social result. And so again, ethnobotany can contribute all the way across the board. So that's the bulk of what I have to say today. I think at this point, I'd like to leave it to the audience for questions, and then we can get into more details on things that you're especially interested in. Thank you.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.